even during eras where a lot of scholars consider the United States to be more of an isolationist power or a regional power, even in the 1800s and early 1900s, we see a substantial amount of US interventions, not just in its sphere of influence, but expanding throughout the world. That was extremely surprising. It was even more surprising to see that the rate of intervention frequency actually accelerated in the post-Cold War era. So we have another line of research that is starting to test now the impact of unipolarity on US military interventionism, because the data was showing us that, hey, the US seems to actually have more interventions per year after the Cold War than it did during the Cold War, when you would expect it to be perhaps more interventionist because of the existential threat that was perceived to be the Soviet Union. So why are we seeing a higher accelerating rate of intervention in what would arguably be a more stable post-Cold War order?
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm here today with Dr. Sidita Kushi, who's an assistant professor of political science at Bridgewater State University, where she teaches courses on international relations, quantitative methods, and US foreign policy. She's also a highly engaged researcher whose work on violent conflicts, military interventions, and the effects of economic crisis has been published in various high-ranking academic journals. She recently served as the research director of the Military Intervention Project, the MIP, within the Center of Strategic Studies at Tufts University. She co-authored a book that introduces new empirical trends of US military interventions from 1776 to 2019, forthcoming at Oxford University Press. She worked on this fascinating project with her colleague, Dr. Monica Duffy Toft, and if I understand this correctly, the work is based on the MIP database, which chronicles nearly 400 instances of US military intervention. We are here today to discuss this project, its challenges, and certainly also some insights about US interventions. Dr. Kushi, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Likewise. Let's start with your fascinating work, this database that you created. Can you tell us more? What is the MIP? How did you get the idea to make that, and where is it now?
Of course, I'd be happy to. So let's start from the beginning. So the initial idea to measure every instance of US military intervention since the founding of the country until the modern day actually did come from my colleague, Dr. Monica Duffy Toft. She is the director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School, and she had been looking for data on a specific number of US military interventions during specific eras of policymaking, and she was encountering some limitations in the existing data sources. So she had the idea to come up with a new data set and hired me as the research director to undertake this project and to create the protocol, to manage the coding, and to supervise our research assistants and our graduate researchers as well. So this project came from the need to expand existing data sources on US military interventions. So the initial idea came from my colleague, Monica Duffy Toft, and it was because there was a lack of existing complete data sources related to US military interventions. Of course, other data sets do exist. I'm more than happy to discuss those other data sets, but there was not yet a data set that extended from the 1700s until the contemporary era. Our data set ends in 2019, but we will continue to update it as the years progress. So the main purpose for creating this data set was to see exactly how the US has relied on military force, not just today, but whether there have been any large historical jumps or patterns, whether there is a larger trend that we are not able to see without complete data sources on US usage of force abroad. So really the endeavor was this curiosity. we didn't necessarily have a specific question that we wanted to test using the data set, but we can, of course, envision hundreds of possible questions that a data set on US military interventions across history can be used for. As to what MIP is, it is both a quantitative data set of every single confirmable instance of the United States threat to use force, display of force, usage of force, and war from 1776 until 2019. And it is also a qualitative project because every single data point that we list in our data set comes with a case narrative, a 2 to 3 page long description of what the intervention was, the outcome, the events that preceded the intervention, and what the cost of the intervention was in terms of fatalities, as well as much information we can get in terms of the cost of the military technologies and other financial considerations. Within every single one of these narratives, we also have a section listing any discrepancies that we find in other sources, and we list our references. So we directly list where we found information about that specific data point. So anyone who is interested in delving deeper into a specific case or a part of the world or a specific year can look directly in our case narratives and go from there.
That's what's so amazing about your database. You add at least 3 sources that talk about these instances. So it's not just something that you found, a list that you found somewhere. You actually then went on, checked each individual case. And I suppose that that's even more important for all the kind of murky instances back in the past, because I recall that in another talk you were saying you also listed instances when the US was fighting, for instance, like Native American tribes, right?
Yes. So it was a process. So what we actually had to do as part of the data set collection effort is we initially scoured all available sources, including existing other data sets, and we collected this preliminary case universe using historical archives, using the Congressional Research Service list of US military interventions. That is a wonderful resource, but it is a qualitative list that aggregates many interventions together. So we relied on that. We relied on existing main data sets. And then we actually went through and created case studies of every single source that we could find on a specific intervention. And we came to realize that a lot of the preliminary case universe wasn't holding up to this standard of at least 3 scholarly sources for confirmation. So in our code book, we also have this list of uncertain cases that didn't make the threshold for our MIP project. But if given more time or given more uncovered sources or documentation, perhaps they could someday be included as an intervention. But we were heeding on the side of caution. If we couldn't find 3 separate sources to confirm US usage of force, threat of force, or display of force, then it did not go into the main MIP data set. So that's why sometimes I tell people 400 seems like a lot of interventions, but it is most likely an underestimation because there are a lot of cases that we could not confirm. And there are a lot of cases that we simply don't know that we don't know because of the special operations covert nature of the missions. And you talked about the frontier wars as well. We did initially collect data sets on the frontier wars. One specifically that we relied on is by Dr. Jeffrey Friedman. He was kind enough to give us that data, but we very quickly realized that if we integrated the frontier wars into our MIP data set, it would overshadow everything else. It was thousands of conflicts between over 100 American Indian nations against the US government. So if we were to treat those conflicts as foreign policy, as I would argue we should, it would mean that MIP would be primarily a data set of the frontier wars with a small blip for more traditional military operations. So we chose to separate those instances and focus on the Frontier War Project next as a standalone for MIP.
It's a wonderful example for how difficult it can be, right, to have a quantitative approach to a qualitative problem, which is basically the nature of war, because you're looking at 250 years of that. This is one thing that's often difficult to explain to colleagues from the natural sciences. It's like, okay, hey, why is your research so uncertain? Why is there all the ifs and buts and when and so on? Why no hard data? Like, well, obviously the nature of US warfare or US intervention changed over time, and therefore you lose the very subject that you're trying to grab, and then the only thing you can do is to have control for that, check for that, or like just say there's a big difference. So, but if we go back to this data set, the way that the methodology that you used, what's the insight on the very top level? What are your main aha moments from these cases?
Well, the main aha moment, I think, for both Monica and myself was how frequent these interventions have been throughout history, even during eras where a lot of scholars consider the United States to be more of an isolationist power or a regional power. Even in the 1800s and early 1900s, we see a substantial amount of US interventions, not just in its sphere of influence, but expanding throughout the world. That was extremely surprising. It was even more surprising to see that the rate of intervention frequency actually accelerated in the post-Cold War era. So we have another line of research that is starting to test now the impact of unipolarity on US military interventionism, because the data was showing us that, hey, the US seems to actually have more interventions per year after the Cold War than it did during the Cold War, when you would expect it to be perhaps more interventionist because of the existential threat that was perceived to be the Soviet Union. So why are we seeing a higher accelerating rate of intervention in what would arguably be a more stable post-Cold War order? So that was extremely surprising for both of us. And we are looking deeper into it. We are testing the implications of unipolarity. And so far, and again, this is very tentative for now, so far we are finding that unipolarity tends to correlate with more interventionism from the United States.
That's exactly the opposite of what you would expect under all international relations theory. Did you, though, I mean, you include threat of use of force into the data set, right? So
I do. But
are these post-war cases more threat of use of force or actually use of force?
Actually what we find, because we have several ways of measuring intervention, one is through what we call these hostility levels, with a 0 being no military anything and up to 5 being war. So the threat of force is a lower hostility level than the usage of force would be. That's one way we measure intervention. Another way, of course, is the frequency of all interventions. But we also measure the highest military action undertaken by the United States against the target. And then we parallel that to the highest military action undertaken by the target state against the United States. And we find that the US seems to have increased its hostility levels alongside the frequency of interventionism as well. And while target states seem to be de-escalating their interventionism or their response, the US has actually escalated their hostility and high military actions, especially since 9/11. So that escalation seems to have increased in 2001 onward. So that's also quite an interesting pattern. For now, a lot of this is descriptive, but we are very much looking forward to starting to piece together a more causal mechanism and a causal story.
I mean, your research seems to really eat away on the perception that the U.S. is a peace-loving nation or a peace-loving country. Let's put it this way: that works through diplomacy. The United States obviously works, empirically speaking, very much through interventionism, right?
Well, the numbers definitely are there in terms of numbers of interventions, although I would be cautious in interpreting it that way fully, just because the only way to fully confirm would be to have a data set that compares other great powers. around the same time, controlling for similar variables, which is actually something we are going to undertake in the near future. So right now, MIP only traces US military interventionism from the beginning until now. And we notice that as the US grows more powerful, so as the US moves from being kind of a newborn country to being the Western hegemon, to becoming the victor of World War II, to becoming a global hegemon, you see that its interventionism also increases and it targets a wider part of the world, which is something that most might expect. With more power comes more interventionism, more possibility, at least for interventionism. I am very interested to see what the pattern would look like for other great powers across history. So, the UK, China, Russia, what do their patterns of interventionism look like? And maybe they look similar to the US, maybe they look very different. But that is the next stage of the MIP research, comparative military intervention projects, to see if there's something considerably unique with the way the US wields force, or whether this is more akin to great power behavior that we see as countries grow and amass more power, and power leads to them being a little bit or more, much more interventionist in their foreign policy making.
It would be so fantastic if your research at some point, once it becomes comparative with other great powers, could maybe finally give some indication on whether the realists or the liberalists take away the day, whether the type of regime actually impacts the way that these beasts, these animals behave on the international stage.
Oh, yeah.
So is there currently no other no like such database on Russia or on, let's say, the UK during its like Pax Britannica, like in the 19th century? Is there nothing that could serve as a point of comparison?
There are other data sets, and they are, of course, data sets that we have relied on. And this is a building on top of other great scholars and great efforts. We are not the first to measure interventionism, but a lot of the other data sets do not claim to be the comprehensive collection of every possible military intervention for that country. So a lot of them tend to focus predominantly on the biggest, most well-known interventions. Most of them have thresholds for what number of troops or, the severity of the intervention would constitute a case in their case universe. And a lot of them begin after World War II, which of course would rule out some of the other great powers in terms of how they behaved during their pinnacle of power, if you will. So there definitely exists sources out there, but in our perspective, in order to do this, in a very comprehensive way, the same way that we did MIP, we would have to undertake the same methodology that brought us the numbers from the military intervention project, which means at least 3 confirmations, case narratives, and with MIP, we have over 200 variables that attempt to measure possible causes and motivators, and as well as consequences of interventionism. So it would also include those variables within COMIP as well. So I'm sure there's a bunch of things out there, but in terms of our methodology and our comprehensive level of analysis, I don't believe it is there yet.
So when are you going to start? I suppose this needs to be an international research project, because if I remember correctly, even to just create the case narrative for the MIP, you needed dozens of research assistants to help with, right? Because it's a tremendous amount of work.
We had at least 20 research assistants throughout the years, and then of course myself and some postdoctoral fellows as well. But it took many years. It was very tedious but extremely important work. So we are hoping that maybe we will get some support, grant support, and be able to financially put together a team that would be able to do COMIP. We are hoping to get it underway in the next year or so. And of course, with this endeavor, Professor Toft is going to be spearheading that initiative as well, and I will be joining as the director.
Absolutely fantastic. So could you tell us a little bit more about then some of these insights about also outcomes of US interventions, let's say in the 19th and then the 20th century?
Yes, of course. So one of the biggest takeaways in terms of these cause and effect variables that we've thrown into MIP that really, again, surprised me is that as the US has grown in its frequency of interventionism, we're seeing that in terms of traditional geopolitical interests, these interventions are now being pursued with lower levels of national interest. So we have a variable in MIP we call the National Interest Index. It measures the contiguity of the US relative to the target state. It measures the power capabilities of the target state, possible alliances, different levels of alliances. It measures resources of the target state, generally trying to capture quantitatively as much of the traditional geopolitical motives that might get the United States interested in intervening in a specific part of the world. And what we're seeing is that, again, after the end of the Cold War, especially, the US has been intervening within these lower national interest targets. And of course, this kind of makes contextual sense when you think about during the Cold War, the US did think it had an existential crisis of security against the Soviet Union. After the Cold War in the 1990s, we saw this rise in humanitarian military interventionism. So intervening on behalf of democratization, human rights, intervening as a third-party actor. So we noticed that in the 1990s, the US dramatically grew in its third-party interventionism. It didn't start a dispute like it did before. It wasn't the originator, but it was intervening within an existing dispute of other parties. So we saw that as a trend in the 1990s. And then in the 2000s, we saw that trend continue to grow, that national interest levels were lower, but interventionist rates were growing higher. So that was extremely interesting to us. And of course, this measure of national interest does have limitations. It's almost impossible to do it justice in a quantitative way. So the qualitative studies will be really important to assessing this connection, but we did give it our best try in measuring it quantitatively. And I think these results can signal to some important trends that we can explore further. So that is definitely one pattern that we've noticed.
That's highly interesting. You know, in my little universe of neutrality studies, one of the interesting things is that the big backlash against neutrality during the Second World War, the big moral outrage and the big kind of like reckoning that came for the small World War II neutrals came in the 1990s when the Attorney General, one of the Attorney Generals of the US, Mr. Eisenstadt, not an Attorney General, I forgot what he was, a member of Parliament, went in front of the cameras and said, we are now going to look at the crimes of the neutrals during the Second World War, especially like dealings with gold and so on. And we do this now. It's a little bit late, but now we have the time. Before that, we were busy with the Cold War. He literally said that, and then a lot of reckoning happened. That plays exactly into what you're saying. There was just suddenly there was all this capacity.
There was a
left.
vacuum, right? There was a vacuum, not just in how to define security and national interest, but a vacuum in grand strategic vision, right? The US came out of the Cold War, it left containment behind because it was no longer relevant, and really struggled to come up with what its next grand strategic vision was going to be. What were its main sources of insecurity? What were its main objectives? And I would argue, again, not based on MIP, I would argue based on a broader array of research and literature, that the US is still struggling to formulate its main objectives in foreign policy, and it's struggling to define its national interests after the end of the Cold War. So I think there is a parallel to be made between that struggle and this growing reliance on force as part of foreign policy making.
What's currently going on with Russia, but also the U.S. approach toward China, which seems across the aisle, especially to China, to be one of rather belligerency, as in China is the next enemy in the waiting, and we need to confront it that way. Does that make sense to you from what you're seeing from your data, or is that also a rather surprising development?
It's hard to say from the data. Historically, what I will say is that the data shows that the US has intervened quite frequently against China in the past. That is a pattern that has been there historically, and it has been underexplored and generally underreported. So US-China relations has been characterized by, military interventionism even throughout history. But what I would add is that Monica and we do discuss this concept that Monica introduced called kinetic diplomacy, that especially after 9/11, the US seems to be relying much less on its diplomatic branch in terms of waging foreign policy and much more on using force as a form of diplomacy. So in that respect, what you're describing with US-Chinese foreign policy would be more akin to kinetic diplomacy. And I will say that one of the inspirations behind coming up with MIP was this idea that Professor Toft coined called kinetic diplomacy.
Thank you for that. May I ask you something of like personal interest? Because the United States until 1941 was very much one of the foreign policy pillars until 1941 was US neutrality. Today, we remember that as US isolationism, which I think is a completely, utterly wrong term. And it actually has been debunked by US historians.
It wasn't very neutral. It wasn't very isolationist, according to MIP, that's for sure.
So according to MIP, not isolationist. And also, but do you see a difference in George Washington, 1793, kind of starts with this neutrality policy, neutrality towards Europe, and only in 41, it goes away completely, right? So there's basically almost 200 years, 160, 170 years of US neutrality that they actually were very proud of the United States. It's something that you find if you look at the documents. There was like US neutrality and neutralism all over the place. But was that a more peaceful time, or was it just as belligerent but in a different way?
So I think there's definitely something there. So in terms of US grand strategy, while I wouldn't term most eras of US foreign policy making isolationist, it would be more akin to a more neutral stance, at least in European and broader Western affairs. So I think that term applies to Europe and to the non-Western hemisphere. But when it comes to the US foreign policy in Latin America, for instance, and the Pacific, you see a very different set of data. So very early on in its country's history, the US was quite interventionist in Latin America, quite interventionist in the Pacific. But generally, the US focused its interventionism within its sphere of influence. So it wasn't really until after World War II that we see that MIP is now showing the US intervening everywhere. So prior to World War II, you saw a lot of Latin America, a lot of Pacific, Samoa, the Philippines. After World War II, that goes away completely, and you see a global hegemon, right? You see the US behaving as a global hegemon instead of as a regional hegemon in its Western hemisphere. So what I think you're seeing there is this evolution of grand strategy. For a long time, the US sought to stay out of European old world affairs and to secure their interests, their territory, and their economy through maintaining control within its sphere of influence. After World War II, the US began to see itself as a world leader, right? And I think that's where the big shift might have occurred.
How about this pivot to Asia, or pivot to the Pacific? And I'm talking about the 1890s, the coup, or like the annexation of Hawaii, started in 1893 with Mr. Dole overthrowing the Queen, and then it took until 1898 for it to be incorporated through an executive order. That was maybe the first time that the US went that far into reaching out into the Pacific, right? Was that also a turning point, or was something else going on even before that?
So I think in terms of degree, there was a turning point, but in our MIP data set, there were, of course, data points prior to that in the Pacific, right, in Samoa. The U.S. was generally trying to maintain their markets for the most part. And one of the interesting trends we see is that a lot of these interventions were actually initially triggered by very private actors. So filibusters who would go into certain parts of the world and they would seek to rule those parts of the world, usually in Latin America, or US private companies that would want claims on specific produce and territory. And the US government would then decide whether they were going to support that endeavor or shut it down. So in a related research project, we are going to look into that. When did the US government back in the 1800s, when did they support the actions of private citizens and private companies and use that to expand? And when did they shut them down and refrain from expanding further? So that is something that we are looking into. But of course, I don't have the full story as of yet.
It's brilliant research, because just look at the diplomatic record and look at who were the consuls and so on of the 19th century. It was always private businessmen. I mean,
Yeah.
the business was way more intertwined with diplomacy back in the days. I mean, you couldn't really distinguish them. So this would make a very great sense, because a lot of this data has been also approached qualitatively. And as I see, you're a quantitative minded person than trying to create comparable data points, right?
Yes, although of course they have to go hand in hand, because if it were just quantitative, I would look at a Nicaragua intervention and not know that it was initially spearheaded by filibuster William Walker. And the data set, if you were to look at it only that, you wouldn't know that difference between a traditional US military intervention and one that was triggered by a private citizen and then involved the US government. So those qualitative cases and the qualitative narrative makes, a lot of difference in being able to assess what was happening. We're just kind of putting it all together and trying to test some pretty narrow questions for now.
Pardon my ignorance, but it's the second time you used that term, so I need to ask, what does a filibuster mean in this context? I only know it as like intervening, I mean, not letting other people speak in parliament. What does it mean in this context?
Yes, so a filibuster is a term that was used widely in the 1800s. It is a private citizen that has their own private militia and followers, and they seek to travel to different parts of the world, usually Latin America, countries like Nicaragua, and they want to rule those countries. They bring their private militias, their private businesses, and they want to install themselves as leaders, usually on behalf of a broader US mandate. Sometimes these private citizens have some government connections, other times they have none, but the government may see their movement as an opportunity or as a threat. So a filibuster is a private citizen with their private citizen army that is seeking to grab territory from another part of the world, and either for themselves or for their country.
I mean, how can we get your Excel spreadsheet?
Of course. So the data is published within an article in the Journal of Conflict Resolution. The policy that they generally have is, as soon as the journal has an issue number, as soon as the article is placed within the hard copy issue number, then the replication files that we have sent to them get posted on the JCR depository. So that's not currently done yet. It takes a while for a journal to go from online first to being issued a number, but we have already been sending the data set, the spreadsheets, the case narratives, the code book, even the backlog template and the do files to anyone who emails us for it. And very soon it will all be up on the Center for Strategic Studies website. We are just waiting for the JCR article to assign us that issue number so we can proceed. But for anyone who is interested in getting that data, the code book, and the case narratives, just send me an email. I'm more than happy to provide it for you here if you'd like, and I'll send it to you right away.
I'll put all of that and the links to your homepage in the description of this video, so people can find it and then write you there. And hopefully, by the time people watch it, it will also be out. I mean, this is a fantastic resource. I can only congratulate you again and again, because it doesn't happen very often that researchers produce this kind of very large data sets that can then become so useful to other researchers. I will definitely look into it, what I can learn from your data set about neutrality, and I hope other people reach out to you and then collaborate, because like a data set on Russia, a data set on China, a data set on the United Kingdom will be fantastic to have. This will push our understanding of violent interstate conflicts way ahead.
And I'm excited to see what you learn with neutrality studies through that data set. That's the best part of this, seeing what questions different people pose and what they find out, because every single one of us has very different kind of objectives to pursue using the data. Personally, I want to look into, the outcome. When do these interventions, succeed, depending on how you define succeeding, and when do they fail in terms of both cost and objectives and in humanitarian outcome. So personally, that's what I'm going to use the data for. But already I'm getting so many different ideas that other people want to pursue in applying the data. So, and of course, it was a team effort. I was, not doing this work alone. It was initially spearheaded by Professor Toft, and we had so many wonderful graduate students and research fellows that helped us make this data set available publicly soon, hopefully for everyone.
Absolutely. And I hope to speak to you again once your book is out. I mean, I suppose that book is your initial findings on your data set, right? The one
By
coming out
era.
of Oxford.
So while the data set focuses general trends, the book has dedicated a chapter on a very specific era of foreign policy making, and it includes historical case narratives, grand strategic discussions, as well as specific era-based data on U.S. interventionism. So it hones in on the broader patterns that MIP introduces. So yes, for sure, we'd love to talk about the book once it's out. We believe it will be out sometime in January or February of 2023.
Dr. Kushi, thank you very much for talking today, and all the best with your research.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you for the very insightful questions that you posed, and I really appreciated the opportunity.
Likewise. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.